new season officially begins. That 12-4 record, well, that was just the ticket to get into new season that we have. That is the postseason. We have entered the portal, the matrix, the postseason. It's on, folks. The Bengals take on the Ravens this weekend, just a week removed from having beaten them Sunday afternoon. And it should be a good one. Welcome into a postseason preview edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. Muhammad Ahmad, Andrew Gillis, and Mike Neislick are here ready to set the stage. And before we do, I'm sure many of you already know, but Damar Hamlin, who has been the center of the NFL world and really the world at large, has been discharged from UC Medical Center as of Monday. We're taping this on Monday for those who are listening to this later, but it's just really remarkable because, you know, this is almost not even a full week after he was admitted after he suffered cardiac arrest on the field against the Buffalo Bills on Monday night. So in just under a week, you know, he was able to, grab hands and then get off the breathing tube and respond and stay neurologically intact, like the doctor said. And, you know, he's on social media, posting on Twitter, on Instagram. And so now he's headed back to Buffalo, where he's going to continue his recovery from there, which, you know, that's going to be on his terms now. But, I mean, how nice is that, guys? I mean, I know that put a smile on my face. I know, like, Zach Taylor was talking today, and right away he just said, like, I think the word he used was unbelievable. Like, you know, and that's something that was really, you know, close to him this week with, you know, having been in the middle of all that. But how about that, man? That's definitely got to make you guys feel good to start the week, is just seeing that. I think that was awesome.
You could really kind of tell how much it mattered to players on the Bengals and Zach Taylor, like you mentioned. He obviously, he said this was a miracle. So I think that this, you could see the turn during the week. On, I believe it was Thursday morning, there was some really good news. The Bengals kind of took that and ran with it, felt better. Friday morning, same thing. So this, it's good news, obviously, for everybody. The Bengals were obviously just kind of waiting on news, just like everybody else. And they're obviously really happy to see it. And I think it kind of takes a load off of their shoulders for sure.
Well, it may have been miraculous. I don't know if it was a miracle in the sense that I think you have to credit the first responders, all the people, the trainers on the field that work so quickly, his first-rate world medical care that he received. Those are the people that deserve all the credit kind of in the world for getting him on the right path. And obviously, you know, his the shape he was in and the work he put in obviously helped him, himself to sort of make it through, to be young and fit like that. Probably helped save his life as well. So I think that can't, get under sort of stated in all of this, that, seconds mattered, not just minutes, seconds, and they were up to the task. And I think both organizations have made sure to mention that sort of at every turn.
You know, it's crazy because he didn't have a pulse for a couple minutes, like you said, Mike, from a matter of seconds and moments. He didn't have a pulse until, the CPR compressions with the IV resuscitated him. So, you look at the precision that the Bills medical staff had. I forget the name of the personal trainer who gave the CPR, but they gave him a game ball after the Bills beat the Patriots yesterday, because he literally was one of the people who saved his life in that moment before they took him to UC Medical Center. And I think the most beautiful thing that, we can look back on with all of this is, like that GoFundMe, which no one knew about until that night. It had already had the $2,500 goal met that Damar Hamlin set for himself when he was, making his own money for the fundraiser, raising his own funds for his foundation back home in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. And to go from that to, I think now it's almost $9 million. And I'm sure it'll go up a little higher even now. I mean, $9.5 million. Like, it's beautiful because, it wasn't just like football fans. I mean, I think I said this on the podcast, like my mom she knows nothing about football. Like she knows what a touchdown is. And I think that's about it. And even she was just like donating to his foundation and just making sure he was okay. And I think really the way humanity came together for one person, and even though he was just like, again, he wasn't a household name before this, he was a backup safety who was drafted in the 6th round last year, but it didn't matter. He was a human being. He had dignity and humanity and compassion like the rest of us. And I think the world really reciprocated that. So when you put good in the world will give you good back. But now that, we've kind of gotten through that, and we have the certainty of where he's at with his recovery. You know, the focus now shifts to the playoffs, like we mentioned, to kind of open this podcast up. Again, the Bengals will rematch the Ravens Sunday, and this is actually crazy, guys. I don't know if you know this, but 12 years ago in 2009, the Bengals played the Jets on Sunday Night Football in the last week of the season. And no matter how that game went, I think the Bengals were going to play the Jets in the wild card round. Bengals lost that round in New York. So the Jets come to Cincinnati a week later, and this is when they had Mark Sanchez. Like, that was the first year Mark Sanchez was quarterback, and they went to Indianapolis and almost stunned, Peyton Manning's Colts. But it started in Cincinnati, and the Jets upset the Bengals. I forget the score, but it was by at least 2 touchdowns. So, this isn't the first time the Bengals have actually had to, face a team in the playoffs a week after playing them in the regular season. And we talked a lot about that on the podcast yesterday, but to kind of revisit that, we don't know about Lamar Jackson yet, because they haven't practiced this week yet, because, again, this is Monday that we're talking. But, the thing that I think we kind of talked about besides just setting up the Ravens is, that second half on offense. It wasn't great. They were scoreless on 7 of 8 drives. But I kind of watched a little bit of the highlights and the film a little bit before this podcast. And look, it wasn't great. I do think, Burrow got sacked twice when he wasn't touched in the first half. Receivers weren't as open. He made some questionable throws. But do you think that's an actual concern of, what is Joe Burrow doing? Or do you think it's hey, we're up 24-7. We're not going to throw this game away, obviously, but we're not going to put our feet too hard on the gas pedal because we just want to win this game. How do you kind of look at that? Do you think they really were just oh no, or do you think it was more we're going to lay back a little bit and maybe the Ravens kind of caught up to them at a point?
No, Brian Callahan said this today where he was just the overthrow to T. Higgins was, the one that would have been a touchdown, which ironically Joe Burrow threw a really, really great ball to Jamar Chase. I think it was the next play and they scored. But, Brian Callahan kind of joked, he overthrew T and you're what are you doing? How do you miss that? And then you kind of have to take a step back and be okay, well, it's Joe Burrow. He's going to miss some throws from time to time because every quarterback misses some throws from time to time. The offensive issues for me, in that second half, if I were to kind of point to one thing, I wouldn't really be, very concerned with the way that Joe Burrow played or kind of the lack of offensive production. The concern for me is what is that right side of the offensive line going to look like? Max Scharping is going to have to step in at right guard. Adeniji still at right tackle. So that's the concern. That's the number one area where you kind of point to and say, okay, this is a really big issue, and we don't know what this is going to look like until Sunday at kickoff. The Burrow stuff and the lack of points, I really don't take a ton from that.
Yeah, basically everybody could have a bad day at the office, I think is how Brian Callahan described it. And, he said you kind of take it for granted that he wouldn't. But there's no sort of deeper meaning to having, making a couple of bad throws. I just think it's surprising when it happens to, one of the better quarterbacks in the league. And, the struggle started. They scored on their first 3 drives, punted twice at the end of the half. And that's sort of where everything kind of went wonky. You scored there, and then you don't have to worry about the second half. And that's, I think, when they got a little maybe more vanilla on offense. And so you sort of discount some of what happened there just because they weren't throwing out plays that they kind of wanted to hold back for the rematch. Because obviously, as they're looking up at the Buffalo game, and they kind of knew where the game was trending. But as far as a larger concern, Joe Burrow is the least of them for this week.
Yeah, and that's the thing is if you really want to even take any meaning, because you're right, there's not much to read into it, and I say this half sarcastically, half serious, but Brian Callahan said it, when we overreact to Joe Burrow overthrowing T. Higgins, like Andrew said, we're just spoiled. We're just kind of spoiled because this dude doesn't normally miss like that. And this is the thing I want to kind of say about the Ravens, since we're talking about them, playing this week. We were talking so many times on the podcast about, is this game going to be a turning point? Is this game going to be a turning point? Looking back weeks from now. And I think now that we're in January, we're getting into the new season, as I said, Like, we can look back, and I can say with confidence that that Ravens game in Week 5 that they lost on Sunday night, that was a turning point. That was when they knew, okay, we've got some things we can and should improve on, and they did. The first and foremost thing was red zone efficiency. They have like the 5th best red zone efficiency in the league right now. I think it's about 69%. But I know it's in the top 5. I'd have to look at the number again off the top of my head, but it's top 5 in the league right now. And you're with teams like Dallas and Philadelphia, who are better teams in the league in the red zone, who are in the playoffs too. And the other thing, and I kind of talked to Brian Callahan about this, and I'm going to write a little bit about this week, is, we talked so much about how a lot of defenses were adjusting to cover two high safeties, more than what they were used to last year, where, Jamar Chase wasn't getting those long balls like he had when they played the Ravens in Baltimore last year. He went off in that game. Far from it, this season in Baltimore because of those 2 high looks. Since then, and I know you and I, Andrew, have talked about this, I think Joe Burrow has been one of the best cover 2 quarterbacks, going against cover 2 for quarterbacks in the league since that game. The Saints game really showed it. And if you remember, there was that classic line where Joe Burrow said, "We know who we are now." Other than that blip of a game against Cleveland, they really know who they are. And so, how do you see, because again, Marcus Peters will probably be in this game. Most of the other players that we haven't seen because of the inactives they had for the end of the year are going to be in this game. I guess for either of you, and maybe starting with you, Andrew, from what you've seen from Joe Burrow throwing against cover 2, how do you think he's going to look against the Ravens cover 2 this time around? How much is he going to prove that, hey, he learned from that game? He can play against any look, including 2 high safeties.
Just to go back to something you said at the hop, I think they kind of found a little bit of a run game against the Ravens, but I don't think that they kind of figured out their offense in that game. I think it was actually the next week, because if you remember down at the Superdome, they went down, I think it was 17-7, and then they had to come back, and that was when they started incorporating their shotgun RPO looks. That was when they started that quick game. So I think that was kind of where they figured it out. So, I don't know if it's, figuring out cover 2 as much as this is just the Bengals kind of taking what defenses are giving them. I think at the beginning of the year, they were trying to force it a little bit. Joe Burrow, obviously, he didn't get his full allotment of reps during camp and during the preseason and everything like that. So you have that weird kind of outlier of a game in Week 1. You lose to a Dallas team, which at the time, you lose to Cooper Rush and the sky is falling. But then after that, you started to see a little bit of an uptick. And, really for me, since that game against the Saints, which they went into with a losing record, that's kind of when they turned around. So I don't know if it's anything, I don't know if you want to make any sweeping declarations of, this is where, they figured something out if you're talking about Joe Burrow, because I think he was going to figure it out. I think that's a logical place to, but he's just been good in these last handful of weeks at kind of understanding what defenses are trying to do and what defenses are trying to more accurately take away. And, I think that underneath stuff and, kind of realizing you don't have to hit a home run every quarter. You don't have to hit a home run every other drive. I think that's really kind of benefited them. And Burrow's been really obviously a huge part of that.
Well, not for nothing. A lot of these games have unfolded very differently. Cover 2, Carolina, that was a non-issue. Some of these games, they didn't have Jamar Chase for 4 weeks. So like you said, sort of saying, teams are playing them differently and have played them, offered different challenges every week. And I think the key word that Zach Taylor has used often this season is how they've adapted to the various defensive game plans. I don't think teams are just solely relying on cover 2, because they've been able to sort of break that, and teams have had to move away from that just because they have been more willing to use the checkdowns. Zach Taylor pointed out today that their running backs have combined 100 catches on this season, so I'm not sure that's that wouldn't be my offensive takeaway for the last sort of this win streak, in terms of how they've been successful.
I think with all that said too, it's not the biggest thing. And like you said, I almost forgot that Jamar Chase was hurt for those couple games he was gone with the hip injury he had against the Falcons where he aggravated it. But that's the thing, is like he was doing that without him. I mean, and now we've seen the rise of Trenton Irwin, which we can talk more about later, because I mean, that guy is something special for what he's been through, being on the practice squad almost his whole career to being on the active roster for the first time. It's awesome. But, you know, when we get back on the show, we're going to talk more about that and what's going to have to work on the right side of the line if the Bengals want to keep Joe Burrow protected in the pocket, and much, much more. But you're listening to the Strictly Stripes podcast.
NIL Now, a podcast dedicated to the name, image, and likeness of today's college and high school athletes.
NIL is not a cherry on top. It needs to be thought about as a part of these young men and women's future, as a nest egg for something when something goes wrong. You know, there's less than 1% of these football players make it to the NFL. You know, their plan B is sometimes not as lofty as plan A. This NIL thing, when you ask what's the next important thing, is to make sure that these players are coming to school for education, sports, but also NIL is a close third in that. It's an investment into these players now that they can take advantage of or leverage their name, image, and likeness to, you know, further their careers. So now you have a nest egg after you've invested so much time into your skill set in college. You should be able to leave college with something.
This is NIL Now.
And thanks for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast. So, as we mentioned, Alex Cappa was injured in that game against Baltimore. Zach Taylor said he didn't have enough information, but that, quote, it would be tough for him this week. I don't want to speculate, but I also just want to say I won't be shocked if we don't see Alex Cappa this week. He did say if that's the case, Max Scharping is going to be the guy. Max Scharping had 33 combined starts with the Houston Texans before the Bengals claimed him off the waiver wire in the preseason. They had to pay a little bit more to get him because of the nature of his contract with the Texans. But, I mean, that's obviously why they still had faith in him. If they're willing to pay that money, then that shows you why they were willing to get him with where they were on the waiver wire. But, you know, like we said, it's going to be tough for the Bengals on the right side. You don't have Alex Cappa, who I think has been one of the best on the line, especially on that right side. Lyle Collins, you know, he's had his ups and downs, but like overall, compared to where they were last year, Collins has given them a lot more protection on the right side. But now you have, like I said, Scharping, you have Hakeem Adeniji on the right side, and behind him, you really only have Deontay Smith and then Isaiah Prince on the practice squad. And aside from Scharping, you have Jackson Carman, which, I mean, I think that spoke for itself on Sunday. I'm not going to elaborate further on that, but, you know, the concern level is high. We all agree on that. But against Baltimore, like you got Odafe Owe, you got Justin Houston, Jason Pierre-Paul, not an elite rush like you would see from the Cowboys or the Steelers or the Browns, who got to the best of the Bengals this year. Granted, it was, you know, when their offensive line was still kind of clicking, but still good fronts. How much do you worry about the Ravens relative to the other pass rushes they faced this year with that injury?
I think the concern's vast. I mean, they're playing two backups. It doesn't matter who they're facing. I think there'd be tremendous concern in terms of this weekend. I mean, having the whole right side of your line is really, you know, kind of scary. I feel like I thought the Ravens really did pressure really well. And I thought in the first half they were sort of the reason the game was a game. To be honest, I thought they were the ones that didn't get the memo that you know, they were waving the white flag. So yeah, I'd be, you know, very concerned regardless of the opponent. I think the Ravens, that's not a good matchup for that. You know, having two of your starters down, and obviously, you know, we talked about this when Lyle Collins went down, that he'd be the one you'd want to be able to replace easily. But Kappa, you know, in that interior, and Brian Callahan mentioned this today, that really can't help those guys. So I think this is like flashing red light, like concern level for the Bengals.
Yeah, and you know, like you mentioned the kind of the beginning of the game there, Mike. Like, it's a fun story kind of afterwards. I mean, it just goes to show you what winning does. You know, because after the game, everybody's talking to Joe Burrow, and, you know, the questions are in a positive light, like, you know, your escapability in the first quarter. And, you know, I mean, we all kind of oohed and awed at what he had to do to get away from pressure. But, you know, kind of the glass half empty version of that is, okay, well, he was under pressure and there was some kind of stuff in his face. Like, that you really don't want to have. And now you've got a Ravens defense, like you mentioned with Peters earlier, Mohammed. Like Peters is coming back, and Brandon Stevens, one of their other corners, is coming back. Like the Ravens are a team just philosophically who kind of believes that you don't really need to dial up pressure with blitzes all the time, or you don't need to do it with, an elite edge rusher. You can kind of get pressure on the quarterback if you can sit back and kind of bait them into mistakes. And when you've got, the corners that they have, Marlon Humphrey, Marcus Peters, you got some DBs back there at the safety position, Marcus Williams, Chuck Clark, Kyle Hamilton. Like, you've got guys that are really, really good in coverage. And if you're just able to kind of sit sit 7 of them back and only rush 4 guys, that's going to be a problem if those 4 guys are getting home, because that is when you get into the danger territory of, okay, Joe Burrow has to make a really, really tight throw. And if he's a little bit off, you're talking about interceptions, you're talking about maybe pick sixes, you're talking about, kind of drives that end quickly. So, the offensive line is kind of a big concern here.
And not for nothing, they've been increasingly one-dimensional. I mean, they're not even trying to run the ball anymore. So
right.
And when they do, it's not even really working. Yeah, because when Mixon ran the ball, he only had 11 carries. I know it's not a lot because, like you said, they're not really trying. It's really just let Burrow cook and do his thing. But Mixon still had 2.5 yards of carry, so you could see why. Now with Pirine, I know it's different because when Mixon had the concussion for 2 or 3 games when he was out, when he got hurt against the Steelers, Pirine did it great with the ball in his hands, catching and running. But even then, they're not even really relying on him, because that's the thing. Like I said, the plan is, you got Joe Burrow. He's an MVP caliber quarterback. Just let Joe Burrow cook. Let him do his thing. But, that's the thing, is we're not really going to see much of that. If we see Mixon or Pirine, it's going to be in the flat, because like Zach Taylor said, they've done great catching the ball. And, with Mixon, I don't want to be too hard on him, but, he's one of the best running backs in the red zone, catching and receiving. He has the 6th most total touchdowns among all running backs, combined receiving and rushing in the red zone specific. I know everything is not just based on that, but if there's a silver lining, say, he scored in the red zone yesterday, and most of his touchdowns have come in the red zone. So he's been a reliable force in that sense. You'd be surprised. Most people think, you get your running back and you punch a ticket in. Not always the case. So with him, he's done great with that, even slightly outside of the red zone. But, I don't know. It's definitely going to be interesting to see kind of what happens with Mixon in the offseason, since, we're in the postseason and we're going to obviously finish the season either in a week, or it could be in 6 days. It could be in 6 weeks for all we know, because the Super Bowl's in 6 weeks. But I do want to see kind of what happens with Mixon, or what they kind of do with him. And that's just something in the back of my mind. But speaking of which, this is far from the offseason, but it is Black Monday. And there have already been openings, as you guys already know. Lovie Smith, who led the Texans to a 3-13-1 season. They did beat the Colts on Sunday, surprisingly, even though they had Sam Ehlinger. The Colts did. Texans told Lovie Smith, "You're one and done." They fired him last night. And then as for the Arizona Cardinals, Cliff Kingsbury, who had a really interesting tenure in Arizona, didn't even last 6 years, which, believe it or not, no Arizona Cardinals coach has lasted longer than 6 years. In their 100-year existence, including their time in Chicago and St. Louis, he's out, which is crazy because he signed a contract extension 10 months ago through 2027. Not a great year. They have the 4th overall pick in the draft. Arizona does. They went 4-13, even with Kyler Murray before he got hurt in the last couple weeks, and they had to go to God knows how many quarterbacks, 3 quarterbacks. And then, of course, with Sean McVay, we don't know what's going to happen with him, but there's rumors that he could step down after, the Rams. I almost said the Ravens. We're talking about them so much. The Rams went 5-11 this season, 5-12, I should say, because they lost to the Seahawks. They went 5-12. And then, of course, he has some personal things going on. His grandfather recently passed away. His girlfriend's family is being affected by the invasion in Ukraine. So they're saying he might be stepping away there. So I guess with that, this is what I was going to get to. Brian Callahan has come up in a lot of conversations about, could he be a head coach? Could he take a job? Even though we're in an offensively tilted league, the same has been said for Lou Anarumo, being the defensive mastermind he is. You have those 2 jobs in Arizona and Houston, you could have a job open in LA. You have the one in Denver that opened after Nathaniel Hackett got fired after a very forgettable season. I know this is super, super early, but since it's Black Monday, just to bring it up, I mean, could you see either Brian Callahan or Lou Anarumo being serious contenders for either of those jobs?
I think you can. I have an easier time seeing it with Callahan, just because the league is such an offensive-driven league. I mean, you just kind of look around at the guys who get hired and kind of why they get hired and things like that. I mean, a lot of times if you're going to hire somebody who is going to be a first-time head coach, you're going to hire somebody who's on the offensive side of the ball, somebody who you know is going to kind of get your quarterback right. I mean, that was kind of the idea with the Cliff hire in Arizona, although it obviously didn't work out a ton. So I could see it with Callahan. I would be kind of surprised with Lou. He's never been a head coach before in the NFL. And I think it's just a hard sell. I'm curious to see if they get interviews and what that kind of interview process is like. But you also got to take into consideration too, like it's more than just, hey, is this guy deserving of a job? Because there's ownership considerations, there's roster considerations, there's how much roster control does this head coach get? How much does he want? There are so many different things that kind of play into this. Which is why, the Harbaugh stuff every year with Jim Harbaugh, that is, with him kind of going to different places, that's kind of been the bugaboo for some of these things. So for me, I think that there's a lot to consider here. Callahan would be the one that I would look at and say, I wouldn't be surprised if he kind of gets into a group of finalists for one job. But we're just going to have to see. I think there's a lot of interesting names out there, though.
And why would you leave this situation for a job like Houston, which is obviously fired 2 one-and-done coaches, or Denver, where you're going to be in a quarterback sort of quagmire? I think, with what they have built here, that, I don't necessarily know that he'd turn down a head coaching job, but I think he'd be at least selective. So, like, of the 5 openings, you really only look, 3 maybe that would be potentially attractive. Does he want to work? Does he see Kyler Murray as the future in Arizona? That situation has gotten messy. So it's like, not all of these jobs, Carolina would probably be the one you sort of want, because it's like you can come in there and institute your own blueprint. But I think there's something to be said for a guy that has a great situation here. He talked about that today with the management here. And then, by the way, you have Joe Burrow in his prime. So, I don't know that he's looking to get out, like they're looking to hit the quick exit button. Where Lou Anarumo is later in his career, do you take any shot that comes up? Callahan, I think, has some time here. It's not like he's running out the clock where he has to leave, because, he has Burrow here for the indefinite future.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off Mike's point, like, there's 32 of them in the world, so I totally get the whole notion of, hey, even if the situation's not great, maybe just jump at whatever you can get, because you never know, when another chance is going to come around. But, like, again, to Mike's point, like, let's say Washington kind of does a surprise move and they fire Ron Rivera. I'm just using them as an example. Like, their ownership is in question, and if and when a new owner comes in, they might have a new GM, and, like, they don't have a quarterback. So I think that jobs can look appealing on paper, but Mike had a really good point where, why would you leave Cincinnati and Joe Burrow and kind of all of this and the talent you have on offense when you're kind of going into the great unknown? So I'd be curious to see, like, what kind of interview it is, and is it a team with a quarterback or a team with a draft pick to get a quarterback? There's just a lot of factors that go into it. And I bring up Washington just to kind of use that as an example.
There's actually one other job I forgot to mention that could open. That's Indianapolis, because I think I'd hope Jeff Saturday's not the future there.
Indianapolis is open. He was an interim coach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one I forgot to mention, because, for those who don't know, he came in, won his first game against the Raiders, lost the next 7. So a pretty forgettable time. And I think that's honestly something that the Colts should be frankly embarrassed of, that they even tried to pull that kind of stuff.
No, I disagree with not.
No, I don't think so.
He did. Jeff Saturday did what he was supposed to do. They wanted him to come in and smile and take the heat. They wanted a franchise legend to take the heat and smile, and then get them a really high draft pick. And they wanted somebody that the fan base, they didn't want to have to bring in some outside guy. They were like, you know what? The fan base's opinion of Jeff Saturday is not going to change if we lose every single game. So I think he did exactly what he was supposed to do.
But why? Okay, so two things. Number one, yeah, I don't think you should get an outside guy. But number two, why put him through that? Like, he's already an Indianapolis legend. He won a Super Bowl with Peyton Manning. Like, he's going to have to kind of live with that stigma of, oh, yeah, you came back and went 1-7. Like,
that's the thing. I don't think he's going to. They're going to look at him and say, you won the Super Bowl.
I'm not saying most people will, but like, that's just awkward. Like, to me, that's awkward that they even put him through that. And look, it goes both ways. He took that offer. He had a good job at ESPN and left that behind for that, which, I mean, I get it. I'm not a coach, but if I was a coach, I'd be like, I had a good time in Indianapolis. I'm not going to go back for that. But I mean, in a way though, I think it's kind of messed up because there were so many coaches on that staff who could have easily been elevated for those 8 games. I don't know if they would have done much better or worse, but like, I digress on that. I'm saying you have Indianapolis. You did mention Carolina, Mike. That's another opening. So, yeah, those could be interesting. But, I mean, let's kind of reverse engineer that and think about this. Like, think about the Bengals when they parted ways with Marvin Lewis after 15, 16 years. They brought Zach Taylor, who, like we mentioned, McVay. He coached with McVay in L.A., helped coach Jared Goff as a quarterback's coach. He ended up going to the Super Bowl. He's doing decently in Detroit now, and what happens? Taylor gets the job at Cincinnati, and look, he went 2-14 his first year. I get what you guys are saying about like, both coaches are comfortable in Cincinnati, especially like Callahan. He's got Joe Burrow, he's got Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. I get that, but like Zach Taylor was pretty comfortable in LA too, and he came to a team which, let's be real, like the Bengals were bound to be the worst team in the league, whether it was with Taylor or anyone else. Like that was not. For the most part, I mean, because you still had Joe Mixon and Sam Hubbard and Boyd and Jesse Bates, who ended up being great. But besides that, like you had Andy Dalton, who we see what he is now at the Saints. Like he was kind of washed up at that point. There was really nobody else remarkable on the team at that point. Carlos Dunlap was done. Most of their defense was washed up. But he took the shot. And look what happened. I get it. He got Joe Burrow. Not everyone can say they have Joe Burrow. But he worked with that. They went to the Super Bowl last year, so you never know. Maybe either of those guys, if they get an offer, they see something in Carolina, Indianapolis, maybe LA. I don't know. I'm just being hypothetical. Maybe they see something and say, you know what? Yeah, this looks like a dumpster fire, but I can turn this into something beautiful. Because that's what Zach Taylor did. He came into like just a disaster, to be honest, and then he turned it around. So who knows? I mean, that's going to be something to follow. And I think Callahan's going to be a very talked about name. So I want to keep my eyes on him. But man, I'm already thinking way past the postseason. I'm just jumping the gun, aren't I, guys?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Hey, what? I always say this. I know Mike doesn't like this, but one can dream. One can dream. Even though we're not sleeping, we're awake. We can still dream. We're going to keep dreaming on and dreaming on later in the week as we talk about what the Ravens will look like as we get a better idea of how healthy Lamar Jackson is, how much he practices, and what he looks like, what to anticipate, and much, much more. But once again, for myself, Andrew Gillis, and Mike Isaac, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. We'll see you back here on Wednesday.